The Arctic, a land where ice buries everything and silence stretches for miles. No one imagined war could reach this far north. But in World War II, even this frozen wasteland became a front line. Beneath the endless snow, the struggle for control reached into the most remote corners of the Earth. Germany saw the Arctic not as emptiness, but as opportunity. A place to hide secrets, track enemy ships, and gather weather that could win or lose battles. Here, far from the noise of the world, men built outposts of steel and hope against the crushing cold. The frozen frontier would become a silent witness to ambition, desperation, and survival. A reminder that in total war, no place is too far and no landscape too harsh for human conflict. To most, the Arctic was a frozen wasteland, impassable, inhospitable, and irrelevant to war. But to Adolf Hitler, it was a strategic prize. Beneath the ice lay routes for ships, vital weather data, and a perfect hiding place beyond Allied reach. The Third Reich dreamed of turning the Arctic into its northern stronghold, a place where secret bases could operate unseen, where submarines could prowl under the polar night, and where control of the skies and seas could tilt the balance of war. From Norway's frozen coast to the desolate islands near the North Pole, Germany's Arctic ambitions were bold, secretive, and desperate. It was not just about conquest, it was about survival in a war that was closing in from every direction.
Before the first German boots touched the Arctic snow, scientists and explorers were already charting the unknown. The Nazi regime sent survey teams north, geologists, meteorologists, and naval officers to map every fjord, island, and icy current. They weren't just looking for land, they were hunting for opportunity. Weather stations, submarine bases, and secret supply routes. Armed with cameras, sextants, and swastika-marked flags, they mapped the ends of the Earth, transforming the white emptiness of the Arctic into a theater of war. Every coordinate, every icy inlet was a potential weapon, data that could mean the difference between victory and disaster in the North Atlantic.
By 1941, the battle for Europe had reached a new front, the atmosphere itself. Weather determined when planes could fly, when invasions could begin, and when ships could survive the Atlantic. The Allies depended on forecasts from the north, but so did the Germans. To Hitler strategists, whoever controlled the weather controlled the war. The Arctic, with its unpredictable storms and frozen winds, became a silent battleground. Germany began deploying weather teams in secret, scientists disguised as soldiers landing on remote islands to gather data. It wasn't bullets or bombs they carried, but barometers, radios, and coded instruments, tools to win a war no one could see.
In the final year of World War II, when the Reich was collapsing and cities lay in ruins, one final German mission was heading north, into the Arctic. Operation Haudegen was launched in 1944, led by meteorologist Dr. Wilhelm Deige. Their destination? Svalbard, a frozen wilderness far beyond the reach of the war's front lines. Their mission wasn't to fight, but to measure, to report the weather that would decide battles thousands of miles away. A small group of men, cut off from the world, built a base of steel and snow, transmitting coded weather reports back to Germany as the Third Reich crumbled. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Arctic station heard nothing, only static. They were forgotten. For months, they continued their work, unaware or unwilling to believe that the war was over.
It wasn't until September 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, that a Norwegian ship finally reached them. The men of Operation Haudegen became the last German unit to surrender of World War II. Soldiers who had fought not with guns, but with thermometers, in a war against time, ice, and isolation.
To reach the frozen world of the Arctic, Germany couldn't rely on surface ships. The Allied navies ruled the seas. Instead, the Reich turned to its most secretive weapon, the U-boat. In 1943 and 1944, special submarines were outfitted for an extraordinary mission: to slip through Allied patrols and deliver men, equipment, and supplies to the high Arctic. Inside these subs were not torpedoes, but weather instruments, food, fuel, and scientists bound for stations hidden under the snow. Each journey north was a gamble. The U-boats braved storms, drifting icebergs, and magnetic anomalies that confused compasses. One wrong turn meant death beneath the frozen sea. When the subs surfaced near Svalbard, they broke through fields of ice, their conning towers crusted in frost, crewmen hacking frozen seawater from the decks. Under cover of fog and darkness, crates of supplies were hauled ashore, the lifeline for Germany's Arctic weather teams. These missions blurred the line between science and survival. Every delivery bought the Reich a few more days of critical weather data and pushed its sailors deeper into one of Earth's deadliest frontiers.
When the U-boats finally reached the icy shores of the Arctic, the men stepped onto a world that seemed unfit for life. There were no trees, no shelter, no sound, only wind and endless white. Yet, here, on the edge of the world, Germany planned to build a secret base. The crew unloaded wooden crates, fuel drums, and strange metal containers, everything needed to build a weather outpost. They worked in silence, their boots sinking into snow and gravel as they hammered tents into the permafrost. The air was so cold that metal tools burned their hands through gloves. They erected small wooden huts, insulated with layers of snow and tar paper. Inside, they installed generators, radios, and the precious instruments that would track the winds and temperatures across the Arctic. Every nail, every wire, every can of fuel had been carried by submarine through enemy-infested waters. It was a miracle of logistics and madness of ambition. When the final antenna was raised into the polar wind, the Germans had done the unthinkable. They had built a functioning base on frozen rock, hundreds of miles from civilization, an outpost hidden beneath the snow, sending signals into the storm.
Officially, it didn't exist. No records in Berlin, no mention in naval reports. Only a few coded transmissions hinted at its presence. A name whispered through radio static: Haudegen. To outsiders, it sounded like any other operation in the endless stream of German military code names. But to those involved, it meant exile, a mission to the end of the Earth. The Arctic base was classified under layers of secrecy so deep that even many within the Kriegsmarine had never heard of it. The weather reports sent from the base were disguised within naval communications, buried between false coordinates and meaningless chatter. Each message carried critical data: wind speeds, air pressure, storm patterns, the invisible forces that shaped warfare across Europe. To the Allies, it was just background noise. To the Germans, it was strategic gold. And to the men stationed there, Haudegen,
wasn't just a code name. It was their fate, a single word that bound them to an icy prison where rescue might never come.
Beneath the silent Arctic seas, German U-boats crept through the freezing black depths, engines humming softly, hulls groaning under the crushing weight of the ice above. These weren't ordinary patrols. The submarines carried no torpedoes for glory this time, only crates of fuel, instruments, rations, and men bound for the edge of the world. Their mission? Supply and protect Germany's most remote secret, the weather bases hidden in the Arctic. The journey was a nightmare. Icebergs loomed like mountains in the fog, and periscopes froze solid in minutes. The diesel fumes had nowhere to go, choking the crew in the stifling cold. When they surfaced, the decks glazed instantly with ice. Men had to chip their way out of hatches. But they pressed on, under orders that could not be questioned. Each mission meant threading through British patrol zones, dodging depth charges and sonar pings that echoed like ghosts through the sea. And when they finally reached the Arctic Circle, they rose beneath floating ice sheets, emerging into a world untouched by war, yet scarred by its reach. There, under the frozen sky, the U-boats became lifelines, silent beasts of steel, carrying supplies, hope, and secrecy to Germany's most impossible frontier. At -40 degrees, the air itself turns against you. Metal snaps like glass. Oil freezes solid. Breath hangs in the air like smoke that never fades. For the German crew stationed in the Arctic, survival wasn't a duty, it was a daily battle. Their small wooden huts were half buried in snow, insulated with layers of ice and desperation. Inside, a single stove fought an endless war against the cold. Water had to be melted from blocks of ice. Food came from tin cans that froze shut. Even writing letters home was a challenge. Ink would solidify mid-sentence. The men learned to sleep in shifts, wrapped in wool and silence, while the wind howled like artillery outside. They grew beards of frost, faces cracked from the cold. Yet their work never stopped. Every few hours, they stepped out into the blinding white to measure wind, pressure, and temperature, readings that meant nothing to them, but everything to the war effort. Isolation gnawed at their minds. The radio was their only voice to the outside world, and sometimes, for days, even that fell silent. At -40 degrees, courage wasn't about fighting an enemy. It was about waking up every morning in a frozen world that seemed to erase you.
They weren't soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles, no medals, only notebooks, barometers, and radio dials. Yet in the Arctic, these German scientists became the eyes and ears of the Reich. They trudged through snow that swallowed them to the waist, measuring temperatures, wind speeds, and atmospheric pressure. All data meant to feed the Nazi war machine. Every number they recorded could alter flight plans, guide submarines, or predict Allied bombing weather. In their wool uniforms and frost-caked goggles, they looked more like explorers than combatants. But their mission was far from adventure. The Arctic was a graveyard for the unprepared. One mistake, a frozen fuel line, a cracked radio tube, or a blizzard, could erase them without a trace. Inside the cramped huts, they huddled over radio transmitters sending coded weather reports back to occupied Europe. The hum of electricity mixed with the constant moan of the wind outside. Ink froze in their pens. Instruments stuck to bare skin. Still, they worked. Methodical, precise, detached. To them, the Arctic was a laboratory of extremes, an experiment in endurance and obedience. But beneath the snow and science, a quiet realization grew. The war they served was slipping away, while they remained buried in ice, loyal to a country that had already forgotten them.
It wasn't fought with bullets or bombs, but with numbers, radios, and the relentless Arctic cold. The battle for weather data became one of the quietest yet most vital struggles of World War II. Every storm, every gust of wind over the Atlantic could decide a battle long before the first shot was fired. Bombers needed clear skies. Naval convoys depended on calm seas. The side that could predict the weather controlled the war. The Allies had weather stations from Canada to Iceland, feeding constant updates into their forecasting systems. Germany, isolated and desperate, turned to the Arctic, the birthplace of Europe's weather. That's why small teams of scientists and soldiers were sent to the frozen north, building secret stations on ice-covered islands, transmitting coded reports through blizzards. Each transmission was a lifeline for U-boats, Luftwaffe squadrons, and field commanders planning operations thousands of miles away. But the Allies were listening too. British patrols hunted for these hidden stations, trying to silence them before the next storm reached Europe. A single intercepted signal could reveal a base and doom its crew. It was a war fought in static and silence, where victory meant predicting tomorrow better than the enemy could. And in that frozen contest, weather, the most uncontrollable force of nature, became a weapon.
In the endless white of the Arctic, there were no roads, no railways, only the sea. And for Germany's secret weather stations, the sea was their only lifeline. Submarines, built for stealth and war, were now being used as cargo ships. Their torpedo bays, stripped of weapons, replaced with crates of food, fuel, radio parts, and scientific equipment. Each U-boat carried precious tons of supplies through deadly, ice-choked waters. The journey was perilous. Icebergs drifted like ghosts. Sonar was useless under the frozen crust, and Allied patrols prowled above. One depth charge could end not only a crew, but an entire mission hidden in the Arctic silence. When the submarines finally reached the shore, they had to anchor near uncharted coasts, unloading their cargo by hand onto sleds, dragging it through the snow to hidden huts carved into the rock. Sometimes storms swallowed entire shipments before they could be rescued. Every loaf of bread, every drum of fuel, every radio battery meant another day of survival for the German teams braving the Arctic night. It was logistics at the edge of the world, where the sea itself became the supply line, and survival depended on the courage of men who sailed into the frozen unknown.
In the heart of the Arctic winter, time stopped. Days blended into endless nights, and the horizon vanished beneath snow and silence. The German weather teams stationed there weren't just fighting the cold, they were battling their own minds. Cut off from the world, radio contact fading in the storms, they became ghosts long before the war ended. The howling wind replaced human voices. The nearest living soul was thousands of kilometers away. They rationed food, fixed broken equipment with frozen hands, and listened to the creak of ice as if it were whispering back. Weeks passed without sunlight. The sky was a black curtain pierced only by flickers of the aurora, haunting reminders of the world they once knew. Some men began talking to themselves. Others stared for hours at the horizon, waiting for ships that would never come. Every sound, the crack of ice, the groan of a shifting glacier, made them wonder if the Arctic itself was alive. Madness crept in quietly,
like frost through a window. And yet, despite it all, they kept recording temperatures, wind speeds, and pressure data, soldiers and scientists clinging to duty as their only anchor to sanity. In that frozen wasteland, the enemy wasn't the Allies. It was the silence.
In the frozen north, danger didn't always wear a uniform. For the German soldiers stationed in the Arctic, one of their deadliest enemies walked on 4 legs, the polar bear. The men were trained to spot Allied ships, not giant white predators stalking through the fog. At first, they thought the bears were a myth, until footprints appeared outside their huts and food stores vanished overnight. Patrols were suddenly more than just cold and lonely. They were hunts for survival. Each step through the snow could mean walking into the path of a creature stronger than any man, faster than any soldier burdened with gear. Rifles froze, fingers went numb, and visibility dropped to nothing. A flash of white, a low growl, and then chaos. The bears were silent, relentless, and unafraid. Some soldiers built crude alarms from tin cans and string, hoping to scare them away. Others began to respect the beasts, calling them the true rulers of the Arctic. In reports, the encounters were written coldly, bear neutralized. But in the frozen silence of their camps, the men knew the truth. Nature itself didn't care who won the war. In the Arctic, both sides fought just to survive.
Long before GPS and satellites, navigation in war depended on courage and radio waves. High above the clouds, Allied bombers crossed oceans of darkness, flying blind through storms, smoke, and enemy fire. Finding the target wasn't just hard, it was almost impossible. That is, until engineers built a secret weapon small enough to fit in a bomber's nose and powerful enough to change the course of the war. It was called radio navigation, the invisible hand that guided bombers through the night. German scientists had first developed systems like Knickebein and X-Gerät, beams of radio signals that crossed over enemy territory. When both beams met, pilots knew they were directly over their target, and bombs began to fall with deadly precision. The Allies were stunned, then inspired. They built their own versions, Oboe, G, H-2S radar, each one more advanced, more reliable, more impossible to jam. Now a pilot no longer needed a clear sky to hit his mark. The war had entered a new dimension, one fought not with bullets, but with frequencies. Every bombing raid after that carried a ghost in the cockpit, a radio pulse whispering through static, telling pilots when to turn, when to drop, when to run. The radio that guided bombers didn't just find cities, it found the future of modern warfare.
They weren't love letters or pleas for rescue. They were lifelines written in code and sent into the polar night. From frozen huts on remote islands, tiny radio sets burred and clicked, punching vital weather readings back toward a Germany that was sinking into chaos. Every transmission was wrapped in secrecy. Ciphered headers, false coordinates, and timed bursts meant to confuse any listener who was not meant to hear. The men who pressed the keys knew one mistake could reveal an entire station and doom those who sheltered beneath the snow. At dawn, a technician would thaw his hands over a dim lamp, tune the set, and breathe into a microphone while the aurora danced above. Sea level pressure, wind direction, barometric drops, numbers that seemed dull in isolation, but together they could decide when a convoy sailed or when a bomber took off. These signals threaded their way through ionized skies and enemy listening posts, hidden inside normal naval traffic, masked by the roar of Arctic storms. Berlin treated each packet of data like treasure.
Commanders decoded the messages, fed them into forecasts, and turned weather into strategy. For the men on the ice, every successful transmission was proof their exile mattered, that their cold, lonely work still shaped battles far to the south. But radio is a double-edged wire. The Allies were listening too, and every cadence, every repeated call sign risked detection. So, the operators learned to be ghosts. Brief, precise, and then gone. They sent their secrets in whispers, trusting steel, code, and the blank white world to keep them hidden. Those hidden signals to Berlin were small miracles of obedience, messages that bridged a continent, a war, and the silence of the Arctic. They were the fragile threads holding a forgotten outpost to a collapsing Reich. And in the end, the same coded lifelines that would outlast orders, flags, and even the war itself.
In the world's coldest theater, silence was the enemy's greatest weapon. The Arctic, vast, white, and seemingly empty, hid secrets beneath its snow. Weather stations, U-boat supply caches, and listening posts pulsing faintly with coded signals to Berlin. The Allies knew they had to find them before those signals shaped the skies of Europe. From Scotland, Iceland, and Canada's frozen outposts, long-range patrol aircraft took off into the unknown. Their wings iced over within minutes, and compasses spun wildly under the pull of the magnetic pole. Visibility was measured in seconds, and one wrong heading meant vanishing into endless white. Pilots stared down through clouds at shapes that might be rocks or the remnants of a German base. Cameras the size of coffins clicked behind them, capturing the faint shadows of footprints, antenna masts, or the telltale lines of a submarine pen carved into ice. On the ground, small Allied teams, Norwegians, Canadians, and British commandos crept through frozen fjords. They wore white camouflage, moved only in twilight, and carried radios that often froze solid. Their mission was to confirm what the reconnaissance photos hinted at, seize any documents, and destroy the equipment before another weather report could reach Berlin. Sometimes, all they found was an empty hut, a broken antenna, and a single journal page. Wind from the west, 20 knots. Other times, they walked into abandoned camps where the Germans had fled only hours before, leaving behind food still frozen on plates and transmitters humming faintly in the cold. Each successful mission tightened the noose on Germany's Arctic operations. Every camera roll, every intercepted frequency, and every frozen soldier trudging through blizzards brought the Allies closer to breaking the Reich's northern network. The Arctic may have seemed desolate, but above the silence, Allied eyes were everywhere, watching, flying, listening. In the end, the war's coldest front was not won by guns or bombs, but by those who dared to find the enemy in the endless white.
When the war ended, much of Europe's chaos thawed into the light of peace. But far to the north, beneath endless snow and silence, one secret refused to melt away. High in the Arctic, on a lonely island where the sun vanished for months at a time, a German weather station still waited. Its name was Haudegen, the last outpost of the Third Reich. Cut off by retreating U-boats and collapsing lines, the men stationed there didn't know the war was over. Their radio crackled with static. Their supply drops had stopped. Yet they continued to send weather reports to a Berlin that no longer existed. They were soldiers forgotten by both victory and defeat. For months after Germany's surrender, the Arctic winds still carried their coded transmissions. Somewhere deep in the white wilderness, a handful of men lived as if the war had not ended,
hunting seals, melting snow for water, and keeping their instruments alive through polar night. It wasn't until late 1945 that a Norwegian ship, guided by Allied intelligence, braved the ice to find them. The crew approached cautiously, unsure whether they'd meet desperate men or ghosts of the past. When the Germans emerged from their frozen bunker, they were thin, frostbitten, and weary, but alive. They handed over their weapons politely and surrendered to a war that had ended months ago. Their weather logs were intact, their base still operational. It was as if time itself had frozen around them. The Arctic reclaimed their camp soon after. The snow buried the huts, the masts fell, and the sea ice sealed away the remnants of Haudegen. Only decades later would explorers rediscover what remained: perfectly preserved notebooks, ration tins, and a transmitter still standing against the wind. It was the war's final surrender, and its coldest secret. A reminder that even at the ends of the earth, the echoes of World War II took their time to fade.
As the Reich crumbled in 1945, its vast web of command and communication began to unravel. What once connected Berlin to every front, from the deserts of Africa to the frozen tundra of the Arctic, started to go silent, one transmission at a time. Wires were cut, radios jammed, stations bombed, and messages lost in the chaos. Entire divisions fought without orders. Submarines waited under the sea for commands that would never come. And in the far reaches of the Arctic, men at Lonely Weather Base kept sending reports to a headquarters that no longer existed. Berlin's transmitters once pulsed with life, a steady rhythm of Morse code and encrypted weather data, vital for Luftwaffe operations. But as Allied bombers flattened cities, even these heartbeats of the Reich began to fade. Antennas bent in the rubble, generators failed, operators fled or were killed at their posts. At the edges of the world, isolated crews didn't know the empire had fallen. They still followed protocol, calibrating instruments and sending hourly updates, their words vanishing into a dead ether. The signal went out, but no one was listening anymore. When Allied intelligence tried to track these transmissions, they realized the eerie truth. Germany's once mighty communication network had collapsed, leaving fragments, ghost signals, half-sent words, and confused coordinates echoing across the airwaves. For the men of the Arctic base, silence became their only reply. No orders to return, no confirmation, no acknowledgement. Just the static hum of a world that had moved on. It was more than the end of communication, it was the end of connection itself. A war once fought with precision and coordination had ended in silence and snow.
When the war ended in May 1945, the world erupted in relief. Bells rang, flags rose, and soldiers returned home. But far beyond the celebrations, hidden beneath the Arctic snow, a small group of German men still waited for orders that would never come. They were the weather team of Operation Haudegen, sent to one of the most remote outposts on Earth, the barren island of Spitsbergen, high above the Arctic Circle. Their mission was simple, yet vital: send weather reports to guide the Luftwaffe and U-boats. But when Germany fell, their radios fell silent, and no one told them the war was over. Weeks turned into months. The endless daylight of the Arctic summer gave way to darkness and cold. The men rationed supplies, repaired their station, and continued their duty as if the Reich still stood. They sent out weather transmissions to a country that no longer existed, signals that no one received. By autumn, their fuel was nearly gone. Their clothes were worn to rags, and still no ship came. They were soldiers of a dead nation, stranded at the top of the world, forgotten by both friend and foe. It wasn't until September 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, that a Norwegian vessel finally reached them. When the men emerged from their icy shelter, they looked more like ghosts than soldiers, frostbitten, thin, and dazed by months of silence. They calmly handed over their weapons and surrendered, the last German unit of World War II to do so. For years, few remembered their story. There were no parades, no medals, no homecoming. Just a handful of names buried in Arctic reports, men who served long after the war had ended, forgotten by history, frozen in time.
May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Across the continent, the guns fell silent. Flags waved. Families wept with joy. The war that had consumed the world was finally over. But not everywhere. Thousands of kilometers to the north, far beyond the Arctic Circle, a small German outpost still lived under the illusion that the Reich endured. Cut off from communication, battered by storms, and buried in snow, the men of Operation Haudegen continued to serve a nation that no longer existed. They still rose each day to record the wind, the pressure, and the temperature. They still sent coded weather reports to Berlin, not knowing that Berlin was now rubble. Their commander still signed his logbooks with Heil Hitler, even as the Führer's ashes lay in the ruins of his bunker. By summer, it became clear no submarine was coming. Their radio calls went unanswered. They were marooned at the end of the earth. Food dwindled. The Arctic cold closed in. Yet they clung to discipline. Soldiers without an army, fighting a war already lost. It wasn't until September 1945, months after Germany's surrender, that a Norwegian seal hunting vessel found them. The crew couldn't believe what they saw. Uniformed Germans stepping out of a snow-covered hut, saluting and formally surrendering. These were the last soldiers of the Third Reich to lay down their arms. For them, the war hadn't ended in May. It ended in the frozen silence of the Arctic, when they finally realized that the world they'd fought for no longer existed.
High above the Arctic Circle, where the sun disappears for months and the sea turns to ice, a lonely group of German soldiers stood watch, long after the rest of the world had moved on. This was Operation Haudegen, the final Nazi weather station of World War II. Their mission? Gather meteorological data for the Luftwaffe and U-boat fleet. In an age before satellites, weather was a weapon, and these men were its last soldiers. They built their base on the frozen island of Svalbard, surrounded by nothing but glaciers, polar bears, and silence. Every day, they measured wind, pressure, and temperature, transmitting reports back to Berlin that no one was left to receive. When Germany fell in May 1945, their radios went quiet. Weeks turned into months. Supplies ran low. Still, they followed their orders, believing someone would come. But no rescue came. No U-boats surfaced. The Reich that had sent them north was gone. Finally, in September 1945, a Norwegian ship appeared through the fog. The Germans stepped out of their frozen outpost, saluted, and surrendered. The war, for them, had lasted 4 months longer than for anyone else. They became known as the last Nazis to surrender, stranded in the Arctic, forgotten by their own nation, serving a ghost empire beneath the Northern Lights.
May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across the continent, the guns fell silent. Cities erupted in celebration.
Flags waved where ruins still smoked. The war, at least in Europe, was finally over. But not everywhere. Scattered across the globe, German outposts, submarines, and garrisons still held their positions, unaware or unwilling to believe the Reich had fallen. In the Arctic, in the Atlantic, in Asia, and even deep in the Alps, the war dragged on for days, weeks, and even months. On remote islands and frozen tundras, German crews waited for orders that would never come. Some refused to surrender out of loyalty, others simply had no way to confirm the news. U-boats continued to prowl the Atlantic, their captains hearing fragmented radio messages, unsure if they were real or Allied deception. One by one, they surfaced and surrendered, flying black flags instead of swastikas. In Svalbard, the men of Operation Haudegen continued their lonely vigil, the last soldiers of a lost cause, still measuring Arctic winds for a nation that no longer existed. When they finally surrendered in September 1945, it marked the final German capitulation of World War II. Even after the world declared peace, the echoes of war still lingered, carried by forgotten men, drifting submarines, and the frozen wind of the Arctic North.
It began with a radio signal, faint, irregular, but unmistakably German. Months after the war had ended, the Norwegian government received word something was transmitting from the far north. At first, no one believed it. The Arctic was supposed to be empty, abandoned, lifeless, and buried under snow. But the signal persisted, pulsing through the static of the polar night. A small Norwegian expedition set out, sailing through the icy waters toward Svalbard, uncertain of what they would find. The war was over, but the fear of hidden U-boats and secret German bases still haunted every frozen wave. When they reached the desolate shore, they saw it, a weather station, half buried in snow and ice, antennas still reaching toward the sky. Smoke rose weakly from a small hut, and inside they found a team of German soldiers, gaunt, frostbitten, and still in uniform. Their weapons were stacked neatly in the corner. They stood, silent, waiting. The leader stepped forward and said calmly, "We are ready to surrender." It was September 1945, 4 months after Germany had fallen. These were the men of Operation Haudegen, the last outpost of the Third Reich, forgotten by their own nation and unknown to the Allies. For Norway, it was a haunting discovery, proof that the war's shadow still lingered in the coldest corners of the earth. The Arctic had kept its secret well.
When Norwegian rescuers entered the weather station, it was as if time itself had stopped. The Arctic cold had frozen everything in place. Radios still set to German frequencies, notebooks filled with coded weather data, and maps spread across the tables marked with U-boat routes and atmospheric readings. In one corner stood barrels of fuel and crates of rations, their labels still legible beneath a layer of frost. Even the typewriters were intact, keys frozen mid-sentence. The air was still, silent except for the crackle of the half-buried generator. For the Norwegians, it was like stepping into a perfectly preserved time capsule of the Third Reich's obsession with control, even over the weather. Every document, every wire, every chart had a purpose: to give Germany the skies. They collected everything: the frozen instruments, the coded reports, even the soldiers' diaries. All became priceless evidence of a forgotten Arctic front. Decades later, historians would uncover how much of the data survived: weather patterns,
transmission logs, and engineering designs that would later influence both NATO meteorology and Cold War Arctic research. The snow had buried the men's mission, but it had also preserved their work, a frozen archive of science and survival at the edge of the world.
For years after the war, rumors swirled about what the Germans were really doing in the Arctic. Some said the weather stations were only a cover, that deep beneath the ice they were building hidden submarine pens or even launch sites for secret weapons aimed at the Allies. Others claimed that high-ranking Nazis fled north in the war's final days, escaping justice by hiding in underground bases beneath the glaciers. Whispers of New Swabia, an Antarctic sister to the Arctic base, fueled wild theories of a Fourth Reich in the frozen wilderness. In truth, much of it was born from mystery, the isolation, the missing records, and the sheer improbability that men could survive up there at all. When the Allies found German-built weather outposts and U-boat wrecks buried in ice, the discoveries only deepened the speculation. But reality was stranger and more human. The Arctic Reich wasn't a fortress of secret weapons. It was a handful of desperate scientists and sailors clinging to life in one of the harshest places on Earth, cut off from the world they once fought for. The myths of the Arctic Reich endure because they speak to something deeper, the idea that even in defeat, the Reich's reach might have extended beyond imagination. But in the end, the truth froze with the men who lived it, buried in snow, preserved by silence.
When Germany's Arctic operations began, U-boats became lifelines, carrying fuel, food, and coded messages to the far northern outposts. But the polar seas were merciless. Icebergs shifted without warning, crushing steel hulls like tin. Frozen spray turned decks into glaciers, and navigation without sunlight or stars became a deadly guess. Several submarines vanished without a trace. U-387, U-307, and others sent their final signals before disappearing into the silence. No wreckage, no survivors. Some were claimed by Allied depth charges, others by the Arctic itself. Decades later, divers and sonar teams found twisted metal shapes beneath the ice, still resting where they fell. In some, the crew remained sealed inside, a time capsule of Germany's last gamble in the frozen war. To this day, stories persist of ghost U-boats spotted under the Arctic ice, still intact, preserved by the cold. Whether myth or memory, they remind us how far the war reached and how deeply it sank beneath the world's most unforgiving sea.
When Allied forces began uncovering traces of German activity in the Arctic, the discoveries sparked imaginations across the world. Abandoned outposts, coded transmissions, and sunken U-boats led many to believe there was far more hidden beneath the snow than weather stations. Rumors spoke of massive underground hangars carved into glaciers, secret research bunkers testing advanced weaponry, and even escape routes to Antarctica. Some claimed that after Germany's surrender, U-boats continued north, carrying scientists, gold, or even Hitler himself to a hidden Arctic Reich. Cold War paranoia only deepened the mystery. When the Soviets found sealed tunnels and strange equipment in former German zones, the stories grew of secret experiments in radar, rocketry, or atomic research buried beneath the ice. But historians found little proof. Most of the hidden bases were nothing more than weather outposts, their concrete bunkers now frozen tombs for abandoned instruments. Yet the legends endure, blending fact, secrecy, and the eternal mystery of the frozen north. The truth may be buried under miles of ice, but one thing is certain: the Arctic still guards its secrets,
whispering through the cold winds of history.
When the Arctic thawed after the war, explorers and scientists began uncovering the remains of Germany's frozen ambitions. What they found wasn't a secret fortress of unimaginable weapons, but the lonely traces of a desperate operation, buried in time and ice. Rusting barrels of fuel, shattered antennas, and frozen radio huts stood as silent witnesses to a forgotten front. Inside one snow-buried bunker, they found notebooks filled with weather logs, meticulous records written in fading German script, the last words of men who didn't even know the war had ended. The truth was both smaller and greater than the myths. Germany's Arctic bases weren't built to conquer, but to observe, to feed the Reich's war machine with data from the skies. Yet those simple weather readings had immense power, guiding U-boats, bombers, and invasions. Operation Haudegen and the others were not tales of mystery, but of endurance, of men who fought not against armies, but against isolation, starvation, and the cold itself. Under the snow lies the real story, not of monsters or secret weapons, but of human will, frozen in time, waiting to be remembered.